Welcome to the BEZA Performance live stream. My name is Marshall Henley, and I'm the president of BEZA. Today is S&OP Thursday, where we get to spend time with friend and longtime S&OP thought leader Doug Dedman of DBM Systems. Welcome, Doug.
Oh, good to be here, Marshall.
We're continuing with the demand stream concepts as they intersect and demand planning as they intersect S&OP. But before we get into that, I always like to level set. Basically, we just define good S&OP as the president's handle on the business, providing a clear link between strategy and execution, allowing decisions, essentially setting the flow rate for the business by family, and then clear actions and accountability. The responsible and accountable primarily are what we focus on in the RACI acronym. And then regular and repeatable processes, a monthly process that you can execute and you can improve on both your business and the S&OP process itself. So the S&OP process and your business should get better every month that you do S&OP, which is every month. Um, so Doug, again, we're doing tolerances and accountability today as it pertains to demand planning and S&OP. Can you kind of refresh us on the accountability side of that equation?
Yeah, it's probably a really good place to start, Marshall. And really, it kind of ties to two of the concepts that you just talked about. One being the measurable side of things and actionable, right? Actionable and the racy side of things. And so, yeah, if we think about accountabilities, and maybe if you pull it up, maybe as a refresher, we'd shown this chart, I think, a couple weeks ago, just in terms of. The five section sheet and thinking
Mm-hmm.
about accountability. And so if we think about that five section sheet and the granularity at which we would look at an accountability, you've got the bookings plan, which is really at the top, and that's the
Yeah.
order inflow. Accountability for that is with sales, right? And so
Yeah.
as we're thinking about that, it's at the demand stream level, as you've already just mentioned.
And to go
Um,
back a couple weeks, that's kind of that's our view of unconstrained demand. That's
right,
the orders
right,
coming in, the
yeah,
POs. What?
exactly.
Okay.
Absolutely. So when you think
Okay.
about that, that's the bookings plan.
Yep.
I skipped over, you'll notice, and I went down to the supply because there's
Hmm.
clear accountability to operations on the supply side. And the granularity is, as you also mentioned this, the families by constraint. So when we think about accountability, those two are, part of the typical sales and operations side of the business. The shipment plan, the accountability, is really separated into two pieces. One being the unconstrained plan, which is the what sales is accountable for, and then the constrained plan is really the output of the process, and accountability lies there
Okay.
with the entire process. And so then we also have the other two sections of this, which are backlog, which is also an outcome of the process. And then we have at the bottom there, which you probably can't see right now, is,
Sorry,
is,
I'll fix that.
is the inventory side of it, right? So, and that really is also an outcome of the process. And so, when we think about it, and it's specifically around the demand planning, we're typically focused at the top three parts of this plan, and that's kind of where we'll spend the time. But that's really where the accountability
Hmm.
sets as we look at it.
All right. So I'm looking and seeing some red numbers there. I'm assuming that those are out of tolerance figures.
Yeah, no, that's good observation. Is if we look at the booking plan, for example, the way that this sheet works is March would have been the current plan. That's the current S&OP period that we were in the example when I grabbed this. Um, February we have actuals, so we have a plan from February which was 2,100 pieces, and the actual which were 6,000 pieces. And then if I go back, I've got January, which I've got a plan and I've got actuals. And if they're outside of tolerance, they're red.
Okay.
So if it's in tolerance, it's black, and you can see that on the shipment side of things. And just it really ties to an important way that we look at the data. And people are familiar with the concept of a waterfall, right? Where I lay the previous plan, and then I've got underneath that the current plan. One of the things we do on that five section sheet is we always make sure when you go back into history, we always keep that last plan number there. So you have a way to actually see, well, how are we doing? How have we done historically based on that, right? Which is really the idea of being able to build some confidence in how we're doing with it within our tolerances, but also to help us start to see, hey, do we have any kind of bias that we have to be worried
Mm.
about on that side? And so each owner is accountable for what's on that sheet and for anything that's out of tolerance or in the red. And when we're working with somebody, especially on the executive side of things, that's one of the first places we start to focus is say, okay, when you come into that executive S&OP meeting, if there's a red number on there, in other words, it's out of tolerance, you should expect an answer from the accountable person for why is that measurement out of tolerance? Like, why did we miss on what we called the previous month?
Yeah, I think as we've put this in place for my clients, there's been quite a few of them where once we get the robust version of this process running, there might be 5 families where the S&OP, the executive S&OP meeting, we're done with those in 10 minutes because nothing's out of tolerance and everything's flowing the way the plan had anticipated.
Yep.
Not so much recently in the last year, maybe, but
Yep.
prior to that, and sometimes still, when people kind of restabilize, they're able to do that. But then they spend their time on maybe 2 of them, and they're not just focusing in on the next 2 or 3 months. They're looking out further than that, but they're out of tolerance perhaps with
Yep.
some of their bookings or shipment
And
numbers or supply.
it's a good observation, Marshall, because also conversely to that, if we consistently see the same part of the plan is always out of tolerance, right? It starts to point to, well, maybe we have something that's systematically wrong, or the way that we're doing our forecasts are, it's not just one thing that's wrong, it's multiple, it's the same thing
Yeah,
happening on multiple families, right? So
yeah.
I think I would make that same observation, but you're right. If they're within tolerance, that's fine, and you kind of move forward. Um, so that's kind of an example of that. Now, I think, well, yeah, I think that's kind of all I have to say on that on that side of things. Probably we can
Well,
start
and
to.
so you did show the 5 sections. I'm assuming we don't necessarily have to set tolerances for every section of the sections, although some might, or there might be some sections that are more important than others.
Well, yeah, and that's important because we establish a tolerance for bookings, and we establish a tolerance for shipments. But if you think about it, we've got that backlog that's in the middle. Well, why don't we establish a tolerance for that? Well, first of all, it's an outcome of the process,
Yeah.
right? And the second part of that is you have a target for that, and that would be sort of based on lead time. And maybe it might be helpful if I show like a kind of a simplified example to,
Okay.
to help people. I'll pull this up. So this idea of plan accountability and tolerance here, and this is a pretty simple example. If I look at those top 3 sections of the sheet, so I've got bookings, which is order in a flow,
Hmm.
I've got shipments, and I got my total backlog, and I have a plan right now for the next 3 months. And you can see I've established a tolerance plus or minus 20%, tolerance plus or minus 10%, and I've actually got book the backlog as really at a target of 2 months, right? So 200
Okay.
units would roughly be about 2 months of shipments. If that makes sense, right?
Hmm.
So in the first month, let's just say that we book 110 units, we ship 85 units, and as a result, our backlog goes, and this was the assumption that we were on target last month. So we're at 200. Our backlog actually goes up by 25 units, right? Because that's the
Hmm.
difference between what we booked and what we shipped. Now, we should be highlighting that number right there, red, right? Because we're out of tolerance, right?
Yes.
And so we would expect an answer as to, well, why are we out of tolerance on that number? So the bookings were within tolerance, so it's not highlighted. It might be a concern because you can see what's happened. Our backlog's gone up by 25 units, right?
Hmm.
So now what happens in the next month? So let's say in the next month that we actually book even more, right? We book 125. Now that's highlighted in red at this point in time
Yep.
because it's out of tolerance. And so we would expect to have an answer on that. And you can see what the result of this is. Even though my shipments are within tolerance, you can see what's happening. I'm building some backlog, right?
Yep.
And if I think about what's the result of building that backlog, Well, that would actually translate potentially into extended lead times, right? Because now I'm actually
Mhm.
at, before I was at 2 months. So 2 months is roughly 8 weeks. I'm now, I've added two weeks to that, and I'm now at 10 weeks. And so I
Yeah.
start to get a little bit concerned. Go to the next month, and let's say the bookings are way down. So now I've got this big jump in my bookings. I'm way down. I'm at 80 units against the 110 plan. So I'm now outside of tolerance. And my shipments, because I planned to do that up, I was outside of tolerance as well. But I've actually taken my backlog down. And
Yeah.
so out of this, I'd want to know, well, what's going on, right?
Yeah.
Why
Did you
are
get
we
some
seeing?
orders earlier than you expected? Did
Right,
you,
right,
right,
exactly. Did
some sort
we
of
did we rob?
seasonal?
Right, rob
Yeah.
from May in April? Was that the situation?
Right.
But there is a concerning story on this that starts to pop out, because it's not just the in and out of tolerance. We actually have a situation of bias, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at this, we are consistently under our shipping plan. And that would be a concern, right? That would be something I want to be able to see, not only if I'm, out of tolerance, but also if I have a bias, because the more you miss month by month, that can be very much a concern.
And just to be clear for folks watching, this isn't a 5 section sheet. It's only the first 3 sections. You would probably go look at the supply and see if there's a problem there or with inventory or something to diagnose what's
Right.
going on with shipments.
Right, because hard to figure out here. You would just look at this and say, well, why the heck, if you have all this backlog,
Hmm.
right, or open orders, why would you not be able to ship out, right? So that might be a situation of a production issue that's come out there. Might be the timing of these orders, because this is just the total backlog, assuming that I can ship all those orders
Yeah.
out as it go along. Yep.
So one of the things I always emphasize in these is this is the president often interacting, or at least the executive that owns both operations and sales. That person is interacting with these numbers in the executive meeting and is asking these questions. It's not just everybody's got to get their act together and then have all the answers. I mean, ideally, they'll have the answers by the executive meeting because they're expecting the question. But that's the idea. And so I think what happens is people see this and they're like, "Well, that's kind of granular. I'm an executive, but it's not that granular. It's the right level of granularity that you should be interacting with, because this is telling you a story about this family. And you're not going to have 50 families, right? You might have
Right.
five, or you might have
Right.
seven, but five are fine, and you're going to focus on two and that kind of stuff. So
Yep.
um, I do
And
emphasize that this is not demand planner interaction only. This is definitely stuff that should be in the executive S&OP meeting.
and your point is really valid, in that the executive meeting is the culmination of those other meetings that came up to that point, right? So we had a demand meeting, and one of the things out of the demand meeting is that if we were out of tolerance, right, from the overall booking standpoint, we would expect an answer for that. And so that's where we drill down to those demand stream levels, and take a look at, well, why were we out of tolerance? What was the thing that drove that? If you flip to my screen, Marshall, for a second,
Okay.
I'll show that just kind of in a more real life example. If I can just pull that up so you can see it. So this is an actual 5 section sheet,
Yep.
and you can see here a whole line of red on the bookings line. So that's basically, and this goes to my point earlier.
Hmm.
We've got, this is current plan. The line above that is last plan. But when we go to the history side of it, we always just keep the 1 month prior plans. We can see, how did we do on the 1 month prior plan for the last 6 months? Well, what jumps out at you? First of all, we've been out of tolerance, right?
Yep.
Five of the
Every
six
month.
months, every month. But
Yeah.
not
Been
only have
running.
we been out of tolerance, we are exhibiting a significant bias, right? We are booking significantly more in that period of time. In fact, we've been doing significantly more than what we've been shipping over that period of time, which means over that period of time, our backlog has been actually grow. I'm sorry, I jumped the line here. Our backlog's actually been growing over that period of time, and
Yeah.
so the couple things there. It's, we're seeing ourselves out of tolerance, we're also seeing a bias in there, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a part of this. The question is, okay, so what do we got to do, right? Like, how do we react to that? Well, either I think we talked about this before, either we start to reduce our inflow of orders, which may not be, the most optimal thing to do, or we have to look at how do we actually increase production? Because what's happening on all of this is we are continuing to extend our lead times out because this number just keeps going up and up and up, right?
I mean, near term, there's got to be a communication strategy with the clients that are now going to be getting their stuff later than maybe you had promised. If your promise dates are slipping, and then you're going to have to long term increase supply, unless you're going to reduce orders somehow.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. I
and
mean that's a huge part of what you're doing with this. And then when you look at that, so we looked at it at the family level. The question then would be, well, where are the misses coming? Which is where we would drill down to the demand stream to say,
yeah,
okay, I've got overall accountability for that bookings plan within, let's say, my VP of sales. But then below that, I might have three different demand streams. In this case, we have five. We've got an all other, and then really the top four customers to see, okay, well, where is that big miss coming, right? And then it's a question of drilling in, and as one of the things that should be an outcome of your pre S&OP demand meeting is the answer for the out of tolerance, right?
yeah,
So you come up with that then, because everything that we did in seeing the forecast or the plan for the month, it's not just a number, right? The number is kind of the culmination of we've got a series of assumptions. We've looked at what do we think is going to happen, and it's those assumptions, the underlying assumptions, that are the things that you want to challenge or validate as you go
yes,
through the process, right? And so
yeah,
this just gives
and
you a way to figure out, okay, well, when do I really need to do that?
And we do show this in a graphical format too. We're showing the numbers because that's one way to interact with the data. It's a very good way, and I think a way you always want to be able to go back to. But again, the executive is interacting at this level with maybe 7 families, and you looking at a different one for each. If folks missed some prior demand planning live streams with Doug and myself, one of the things that Doug kind of referenced is the idea of demand stream. So what you're looking at when you see a 5-section sheet is a constraint based family, where we look at the supply, like how do you make or buy this stuff, and where are you constrained there? Because that's, if you can't make it, you can't ship it. So the 5-section sheet looks at that view, but the unconstrained view is a different view. It's not tied directly, or it's tied to the constraint based families, but there's, as Doug said, 5 demand streams feeding, and there might be 5 demand streams feeding multiple families. There's many to many relationship between demand streams and constraint based families. So we kind of have our cake and eat it too. We can look at a market facing model of the world in terms of demand, but then we feed it into a supply planning model, if you will, in the S&OP process. And so I don't want to forget that. I don't want to let people forget that that's kind of what Doug's referring to. So,
Yep.
um, so we talked about that. If lead times. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm skipping ahead here. You probably wanted to talk a bit about how we set tolerance levels. I'm guessing at this point.
Yeah, I think that's an important question because it's kind of the where do we start and kind of go through that, and just often when we're starting with people, it's you don't have a lot of data to look at, so you start someplace, and so we'll establish a plus or minus on the booking side, and often we'll start at like 20 to 25%, and then we'll maybe do 15% on shipments. And then typically when we get to the operations side, we don't set it as a plus or a minus. We actually set it as an upside plus. And then the minus is really to hit zero. And
Right.
I don't want to spend time on that one,
Right.
but often when we look at
There's a
this,
logic to it.
yeah, there's a logic to that one because if you look at it, and that should be the one that you work on fixing first, right?
If you said you're going to make 100 things, you ought to be able to make 100 things, or something's broken.
That's exactly right. So the example I gave you when I did that sort of little fictitious example, and you're kind of going, hey, well, why the heck did you not ship out what you had? Because you already had
Yeah.
those in backlog. Well, part of the reason on that would be to have to look, as you mentioned, on the bottom part of that, and look at that 5 section sheet and say, well, what happened on the production side of things? And so that's the one you want to fix first, because I know people will argue with me on this side because we've got all these supply chain issues,
Yeah.
but if you
Well,
look
those
at
are the problems that are leading you to miss if you have a miss. So
right, exactly. And
yeah,
so part of this
it's
is,
still a
if,
miss.
if you can't get predictability on your supply and all you're going to do is focus on predictability of demand,
Yeah.
right? You're never going to get to the point of actually improving those parts of the
Right.
process. And this ties into a lot of the other stuff you work on. When you get down into the lean side of things, and how do we
Yeah.
kind of work on that side of it. But
Stability,
yes, getting
stable
stability and
process.
and repeatability in those processes. But yeah, so if we think about how do we actually establish those tolerances, if you're really trying to start out with, and maybe if you flip back to my screen for a second, Marshall, I'll bring up a chart just as an example. So the chart that I have here is really 2 years of history of one. I've only included the 1 month prior percentage error. And you can see this is on bookings. And you can
Hmm.
see the forecast error month by month. And I mean this looks a little bit all over the place, right? Like
Yeah.
that's that it, and most operations people would say, well, how the heck are we going to, have stability on supply if this is what our bookings forecast looks like, right?
Well,
Well,
we do have inventory. We haven't talked a lot about it, but
we haven't talked about inventory, but if I look at this one, so to start with your tolerance levels, the statement I'm going to make is you should start where you are currently. And if this is
mhm,
historically where you are, to
yes.
go and set your tolerance levels at, let's say, 5%, which means anything above or below 5% would be an out of tolerance, which would trigger this detailed analysis of, well, why are we out of tolerance? The problem with that is you're going to end up what you've done is you've just made everything a problem, right? And so it's
Right.
real hard to fix the everything's a problem if that makes sense, right?
Right.
So I like to start to say, well, let's pick it so that if I look at 12 months of history, where are we at if we have one instance that's out of tolerance per month? So if we look at it, if we were within 17% in this example, we would only have these two circled ones that would be out of tolerance. If we
Yeah.
rounded that up, we could say, hey, a plus or minus 20% would be a pretty good starting point for setting that tolerance level. And using that as the kind of the starting point to say, okay, if it's outside of 20%, then that's that would trigger all this detailed analysis as to how we dig in. So if we set that tolerance level, then you can kind of look at it and say, well, now I'm going to look at the plus or minus 20% historically, and then on the forecast going forward. And this chart kind of shows this, and you
Hmm.
mentioned this already. We kind of show the same chart on our 5 section sheet where everything in this gray area is the historical, the actuals within that plus or minus 20% band. And then going forward, we have our current call of bookings and that blue line against the plus or minus band of the last bookings forecast. And what that gives us is, well, where have we been? Do we have, if we're trending always at the bottom of this or trending always at the top of this, I might have a bias there. But going forward, it starts to identify for the executive real quickly, well, where have we made significant changes, especially in the next couple months? Where have we made significant changes that would be outside of that tolerance band? So, like, where are we identifying much more forecast volatility than what in that 1 month out? So, how much did we change that? And so that's kind of an important thing to look at. So those tolerance bands not only provide us a measurement historically, but they also provide a view for how much volatility are we introducing in the plan. Now, you notice
Hmm.
way out here in September,
You
that
got to
number,
miss. Got a
I got
planned
missed.
miss.
But you know what? That's just saying that my September forecast is more than 20% lower than what I had last month for the
Yeah.
September forecast. From a bookings perspective, do I jump up and down about that?
Yeah. Might be
Eh,
perfectly fine.
might be perfectly fine. Whoops. And so, that's the big thing on that. Now, you might be saying, well, 20%.
Yeah, that seems a bit high to most people, I think.
Yeah, it
Off the
and
top of your off I mean, that's from an
yeah,
outset at least.
yeah, and so the challenge on that, and really that ties back to the concept of lead time. And so, plus or minus 20%, if you've got 3 months worth of backlog and you miss the bookings in 1 month by 20%, what month are you impacting the shipment plan? Well, it's not really until month 4 of your plan, right?
Right.
If you miss it by 20%, I'd be increasing my booking plan, or sorry, my shipping plan out at month 4, if that's what my lead time happens to be. And so that's an important thing. So the idea of how these things all come together, if I have no backlog or I have no lead time, then I need to have a tighter tolerance on my bookings, right? Because it's
Mhm.
going to impact my shipping plan in much tighter.
So if lead times are shorter and your backlog is less and your buffer is therefore smaller, then your tolerance needs to be tighter. Is that kind of the idea?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it, right? So if you nailed it, right? Like it's if those lead times are shorter, right, and your backlog is less, then that buffer you have is by definition going to be a lot less, right? And so
Yeah.
you've got to be tighter on your tolerance. Now you might pick up that buffer more on the production side of things by having upside flex on your production, right? Or you might be carrying that in inventory, right? So that's the other buffer that you have. We haven't really talked about that because we've been focused on the demand planning side. So
Right.
if you don't have any backlog, that's typically where you're going to do it. And if the best you can do is plus or minus 20% on bookings with no backlog, that what does that translate into? Well, you've got to carry enough inventory,
Yeah.
right, or upside flex in production to manage on that side of things.
And the 5 section sheet's gonna tell you that. It's not a deep calculus calculation. You'll know based on the plan what amount of inventory you're gonna need to carry, and whether you can create a supply plan to get there is a whole separate issue, but
Yeah,
that's all gonna flow through. So,
it's a bit of a counterintuitive thing for people because I've worked
yeah.
with places where we've worked with them for a period of time, and then I haven't seen how their process is, and you come back and they said, hey, look, we've tightened all of our tolerances, and they're plus or minus 5% on everything, and and I look across the board, and it's everything's red. It's a bit of a bloodbath, right? everything's
Yeah.
everything's out of tolerance, and so the challenge with that is, if everything's out of tolerance, what do you fix,
Yeah.
right? What do you
Yeah.
actually fix?
In lean, we always in 8-step problem solving, we always point at a metric that's out of tolerance. That's the definition of a problem. Um, so tolerance setting is important if you want to have a realistic chance to identify the most, if you're going to lower the water a little bit and look at where the big boulders are that are showing up. I think that's what you're describing as your process. Like start with
Yep.
where you've been, set your tolerances based on that. I think part of maybe what's baked into that assumption is that your inventories will already be kind of compliant with that. If you've been able to maintain those bookings for that long, unless you're just a shambles, if you've been shipping and hitting your your uh, your your CX requirements, your on time requirements over that historical period, then you're going to have a right sized inventory buffer. You can do more detailed calculations. I shouldn't say that. You can be more aspirational later. That's kind of how
Yeah.
we roll, right? Get started with this, and then once you've got the process moving, where you have very clear understanding of which levers you need to pull first, with the limited resources you have, and then second, that's when it kind of makes sense to start maybe tightening up a tolerance here or there.
Yeah. Yeah. If I and maybe I put one slide together, hopefully to summarize that. I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
pop over to that screen for a second. So kind of my main points, and you can't read my title there. The summary main points on tolerance and accountability. The first one is, calculate your monthly tolerance based on historical performance. So that's a little bit of start where you are. As you said, you can become aspirational and you can tighten all these things up, but you want to start where you are, and base it on historical performance. Then assign the proper accountability. Now, you should have already had the proper accountability if you go back to the 5-section sheet and kind of how we charted it out there. But make sure you've got that real clear as to who you're holding accountable for those, for that, especially around the booking side of things. This one's a tough one for people. If the measurement is within tolerance, then it's accurate, right? And so that means, you basically are saying, we're not going to dig into all the details on this if it's within tolerance, because we're going to treat that as being accurate. Because if we've right-sized everything, then that means that we've got the buffers in place to manage within that tolerance level, right? So that's a really, really important thing there. And that's part of it. Really, the last point, or this point here, is use the variability range to implement. Sorry, Marshall, you kind of flipped the screen around on me there. Use the variability range to implement the buffers to stabilize production and shipment plans. So you want to be able to set those, and then track that the bookings are staying in tolerance as part of the ongoing S&OP process. If it's out of tolerance, expect an answer. And finally, after you start tracking, you can start to tighten the tolerance, right? So, those would be kind of my main points on this.
Okay, great. This is excellent.
Hopefully that sort of helps. There's a really good article up on our website that Duncan wrote. It's probably dates back to, I think, 2016, 2017.
Okay.
And maybe you can provide the link for that for people.
We'll put that in the notes.
Yeah, in the notes, just because it does walk through that, and it'd be kind of valuable for people on setting those tolerance levels. So hopefully that what we just went through there kind of the helps out just in terms of people understanding kind of the link between accountability and the tolerance levels. Really, as we focused on the demand side, we didn't jump into. There's a whole bunch of other topics we could jump into from here, but yeah, hopefully that kind of gives a bit of a starting point for people.
Well, I feel like it was fantastic. A lot of content in a short period of time, but really good stuff, Doug. So thanks again. For folks who are watching, make sure you like and subscribe, mash the buttons if you want to keep getting this stuff in the future. And I really appreciate these half-hour segments, Doug. We'll see you in 2 weeks, which is the 23rd. S&OP Thursday on the 23rd. We'll continue with demand planning as it pertains to S&OP. I want to thank everybody for watching, and we'll see you then. Thanks.